Hello, all you wonderful people. This is your friendly neighborhood biologist checking in on Monday, March 30th, from a beautiful day in Central Virginia. My windows are all open, so you might hear birds chirping. You might hear my cat screaming at those birds, but you're supposed to be listening to me. And you're supposed to complete today's quiz before you watch this lecture. And so today's quiz was on Friday's material, the beginning of this chapter. And once that's done, now you can continue with this chapter. On Friday, we talked about blood and an overview of cardiovascular systems in other animals. Now we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about us humans. Your cardiovascular system gets its name from these two roots. Cardia means heart, and vasculum means vessel. So this system is made of the pump and the pipes, the heart and the vessels through which the blood flows. In this cardiovascular circuit, as you know, blood flows from the heart through your arteries to smaller pipes called arterioles, to even smaller pipes called capillaries. This is where all the action is. In capillaries, that's where good things leave your blood and enter your cells. This is where waste products from your cells leave the cells and enter your blood. This is where all the action is, in capillary beds all over your body. Then blood drains out of your capillaries into venules, and then into larger pipes called veins, and finally back to your heart, and one circuit has been completed. Remember, there are two circuits in our cardiovascular system. Last time on Friday, I showed you a relatively superficial figure of this. Now here's a more detailed figure or two. First, let's look at a more detailed figure of your pulmonary circuit, the circuit that serves your lungs. Now you can see a slightly more sophisticated or realistic diagram of our pulmonary circuit, but it still is not exactly the way things occur. And so, unlike last time, now you have two lungs. You have a right lung and a left lung, right? This person is lying on their back, looking up at you. And so this is their right lung on your left. This is their left lung on your right. And as you learned last time, the pulmonary circuit receives blood from the right side of our heart. And so now it's a little bit better than last time, because last time you only had one lung and now you have two. So that's good. The criticisms I will make on this simplification of the system is that these two blood vessels coming into the side of this chamber, the right atrium, they don't really come in from the side. One comes into the top from your head and arms, and the other one actually comes in from the bottom, and it is draining your legs and your guts. Just for the sake of simplicity, the artist chose to put them both dumping in from the side, and that's fine. Also, you will see one blood vessel draining the right lung and another one draining the left lung, now filled with red oxygenated blood that has left your lungs, and there's one from each lung draining into your left atrium. In reality, you actually have four of these pulmonary veins. You have two coming from the right lung and two coming from the left lung, so there should be four arrowheads entering this chamber. But there's only two, again, for the sake of simplicity. Now, here is a more detailed figure of your systemic circuit. Now, we are talking about serving all the rest of your body, not your lungs, right? Over here, this is the right side of your heart going to your pulmonary circuit. Here's the left side of your heart that serves everything else. It sends blood up to your head and arms. Those are upper extremities. Arms are upper extremities. Wings are upper extremities. Flippers on a porpoise are upper extremities. And there are additional capillary beds scattered around. This is still, again, a simplification of what's going on, right? They give you a single capillary bed for your heads and both your heads. How many heads do you have? A single capillary bed for your head and both arms, and obviously you have many, many more capillary beds in your head and arms. Same thing goes with your thoracic cavity. That is the cavity that is above your diaphragm, and so all the organs that live above your diaphragm are served by the left side of your heart. Now you might say, well, above my diaphragm, my thoracic cavity, that's my chest, isn't it? And so what organs are there in my chest? Isn't it just my lungs? And the lungs are getting blood from the pulmonary circuit. Well, the lungs are in the thoracic cavity, that is true. But other organs that live here are the heart itself, your thyroid gland that wraps around your trachea, which is your windpipe, and all sorts of muscles. Each one of your muscles is an organ. And so there are actually lots of organs. If you remember that muscles are organs, lots of organs up here in your thoracic cavity that need oxygenated blood from the left side of your heart. Then below your diaphragm, again, it's more complicated than in the previous figure on Friday. Still a simplification. It gives you one capillary bed for most of your abdominal organs and your lower extremities, which is your legs. And it gives you a capillary bed for all of your intestines, your small intestine, your large intestine. It gives you a capillary bed for your liver. I like that they've done this, however, because remember we talked about this. We talked about the fact that blood that goes to your intestines and picks up potentially any toxins that you may have accidentally or intentionally eaten, rather than sending them straight back to your heart for distribution around your body. Instead, the blood leaving your intestines first goes through customs and immigration. The blood first goes through your liver for detoxification. We talked about this about a month ago or so. And then that mostly cleaned blood, detoxified blood, will then exit the liver and head back to the heart for distribution around your body. Can anybody remember what this odd shunting of blood is called? This is your, sorry, this is so cumbersome, your hepatic portal just talk among yourselves while I struggle with this. System. I'm not going to write system. You all know how to spell system. This is your hepatic portal system. It portals the blood from your intestines through your liver, hence the adjective hepatic, and then it's allowed to go to the rest of your body after it has been detoxified. Okay, so that is a more detailed view of your systemic circuit flowing out of the left side of your heart and flowing back in to the right side of your heart. Again, this blood vessel draining your guts and your legs really enters the bottom of this chamber, and this blood vessel draining your head and neck and arms really enters the top of this chamber. But again, the artist is choosing to include them on the side, and that's fine. Okay, now let's look at your heart, just your heart, in more detail. Your heart lives in a protective sac of connective tissue referred to as the pericardium. Cardium is heart, and peri means around. This has the same root as perimeter, right? This means around, literally around your heart. And that's what this pericardium is. It's a sac of connective tissue surrounding your heart. And it surrounds the heart muscle, better known as the myocardium. You've seen myo before, as in myofibril and myofiber. That means muscle. And cardium again is heart. So this literally means heart muscle. As you've seen in the previous figures, your heart has 4 muscular chambers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2 atria at the top, and 2 larger ventricles at the bottom. We'll get into this anatomy in more detail soon. And the 4 chambers want to contract and squirt blood out of them, but they want to contract and squirt blood out of them only in one direction. They don't want any backflow. So to prevent backflow, there are valves in your heart that keep the blood moving in one direction. One-way valves that function just like the door in our classroom. And if we were in our classroom, I would remind you how that door works, right? It opens into the room. And so it's a one-way valve. If you are in the hallway, you can push it open into the room and you can enter our classroom. But if it's closed and you're in the classroom and you push against it, there's no way you're strong enough to push it out into the hallway so that you can leave. You would have to leave through the window, maybe. And so that is a one-way valve. The door in our classroom is a one-way valve. We have 4 of them in our heart. We have 2 AV valves that are found between our atria and ventricles, meaning we have one right here, there it is. That is an AV valve between this atrium and this ventricle, and this is an AV valve between this atrium on the left and this ventricle on the left side. AV stands for atrioventricular because it's found between the atrium and the ventricle. So there's a right AV valve and a left AV valve. In addition, let's keep talking about them. And the whole point of these is look how they're designed. And so when this chamber contracts, it's going to squirt blood in that direction. But when this chamber contracts, it doesn't want blood to squirt backwards into this atrium. When this ventricle contracts, it wants blood to go that way. And so this AV valve prevents backflow into the atrium when the ventricle contracts. The same thing here. This AV valve prevents backflow when this ventricle contracts, because when this ventricle contracts, it wants to squirt blood into this pipe, not backwards into this atrium. And so both atrioventricular valves prevent that backflow. Now, once this ventricle contracts and successfully pumps blood up into this pipe, and this ventricle contracts and successfully pumps blood into this pipe, now these ventricles are going to relax and prepare for the next heartbeat. While they're relaxing, they of course don't want blood to flow backwards and drain because of gravity, just to flow backwards and drain back into the ventricles, which the blood would do because of gravity. And so there's a valve here that prevents backflow into the ventricle, and there's a valve here that prevents backflow into the ventricle. Again, both of these are one-way valves. They will open to let blood into the pipe and out of the chamber, but then they will close if blood tries to run back into the chamber and exit the pipe. Both of these are found between the ventricles and these 2 pipes. This is the pulmonary artery, and this is the aorta, which is labeled here. And they are not named anatomically the way this one is. This is named anatomically because it's found between the atrium and ventricle. Both of these are named because of their appearance when you dissect a heart. They are shaped somewhat like a half moon. And so because of that, they're called semilunar valves, because some drunk anatomist thought they look like a half moon when they were first observed. And so you have a semilunar valve on the right and a semilunar valve on the left. The one on the right is associated with your pulmonary circuit, so this is your pulmonary semilunar valve, and the one on the left is associated with the biggest blood vessel in your body, your aorta. So this one on the left is your aortic semilunar valve. So 4 valves, 1, 2 atrioventricular valves, and 1, 2 semilunar valves. 2 on the right side and 2 on the left side of your heart. Any questions about that? I guess not. So we'll keep moving. Let's look at a really detailed figure of your heart. Now, things are looking more accurate. Now, instead of this blue pipe and this blue pipe entering from the side, the way they do here, now correctly, one is entering from the top. This is the one that drains your head and arms, and one is entering from the body, which drains your trunk and all the organs, all your guts, and your legs. Each one of these is called a vena cava. This is a vena cava, and this is also a vena cava. The one on top is superior. That's a typical anatomical term, meaning either, it has 2 definitions really in anatomy. If something is labeled superior, it means it's above the heart or closer to the head. And if it's labeled inferior, that either means it's below the heart or closer to the tail. In this case, both definitions work because this blood vessel, this vena cava, is below the heart and it's closer to the tail. But imagine a couple of structures down here. One could be superior and one could be inferior, even though they're both below the heart, right? It's just that one of them, even though it's below the heart, is still closer to the head, and the other one is closer to the tail. And so I could have a structure here and a structure here, and this one I might label superior something or other, and this one I might label inferior something or other. Both are below the heart, but one of them is closer to the head. Okay. Now, what else do we see here? We see the 4 chambers. Here is the right atrium, and here is the left atrium. Notice now, again, it's more accurate. Now we have 4 pulmonary veins coming from the lungs. We have 2 here, and you can't see it, but there are 2 that dump in on this side, and their pipes are completely behind the heart. So the artist couldn't accurately include them in this particular view of the heart. So 2 atria separated from the 2 ventricles by AV valves. Here's the right atrioventricular valve, and here's the left atrioventricular valve. When this ventricle contracts, this valve is going to slam shut, and all these connective tissue bungee cords are going to prevent it from tearing and turning inside out, and then the blood will be forced to go up into this pulmonary trunk through this right semilunar valve, otherwise known as the pulmonary semilunar valve. And then if the blood tries to drain back down again, that valve is going to close and the blood will not be allowed to drain back into the ventricle. A similar thing is happening on this side. When this left ventricle contracts, this left AV valve is going to slam shut and prevent backflow, and the blood is going to be forced instead through this left semilunar valve, otherwise known as an aortic semilunar valve, up into the aorta. Here's the aorta for distribution to the head and the arms, and then heading all the way down for the guts and the legs. What else do I want you to notice? I want you to notice that the wall of these 2 atria is very thin. It's made of cardiac muscle tissue, cardiac muscle cells, which are similar to skeletal muscle cells, but there are some important differences. Anyway, these chambers have pretty thin walls, meaning pretty small muscles, meaning they don't do very much work. Because look what's going on. This atrium needs to pump blood not only just this far, big deal, but it needs to pump it down with gravity. So the truth is, as blood drains into this chamber from your two vena cavae, the blood, most of it, just drains through this hole in the floor. And this atrium really just has to contract just to wring itself out a little bit and empty itself completely into the ventricle. And so both atriums have a similar job, a very easy job. And so they have very thin walls, not much muscle at all, because they're going to squirt the blood straight down into this adjacent chamber. The ventricles, on the other hand, look at the walls of the ventricles. They are a lot thicker than the walls of the atria. And you might notice immediately that the wall of the right ventricle is a lot thinner, thicker than the atrium, but a lot thinner than the big, powerful, thick wall of the left ventricle. The reason for that is, again, the job they're doing. The right ventricle has to pump into the pulmonary trunk to go to the lungs. And so, let's go back a couple of slides. This right ventricle really has to pump blood left and right to your lungs. Again, big deal, not a very big job. But where does your left ventricle have to pump blood? It has to pump it all over your body. It has to pump it up to your head, out to your arms, down to your guts, into your legs, all the way to your toes. And so your left ventricle has the most difficult job in all of your heart chambers. And so it has the strongest, thickest, most muscular wall. Okay, that's all I want to say about heart anatomy. Now, we're going to move from anatomy into physiology. We're going to move into how this thing functions as a pump. And we're going to talk about all the events within a single heartbeat. All the events in a single heartbeat is known as the cardiac cycle. The cardiac cycle is a single heartbeat when it beats and relaxes. That is one cardiac cycle. And all the valves that open and close, and all the chambers that contract and relax, and all the blood that moves from here to there, all of that happens in a cardiac cycle. As you know, of course, your heart will relax. This is called diastole, and then your heart will contract. That's known as systole. Now, when this chamber is contracting, right, as you can imagine, when this thing is contracting, it is increasing the pressure on the blood inside this chamber as it forces it up into your aorta. And so, during systole, during contraction, the pressure is high. But then, when this chamber is relaxing, now the pressure is going to drop. The pressure is going to drop because the walls are relaxing and the volume of the chamber is expanding and the blood inside is not being squeezed and not being pressurized. And so you will alternately have high pressure squirting into your aorta and then have lesser pressure during these periods of relaxation. For this reason, when we take your blood pressure, we always record two numbers: the high pressure number when your heart is contracting and the low pressure number when your heart is relaxing. And we measure this in millimeters of mercury. We don't exactly do it this way anymore, although we use the same units. But in the old days, we literally would have a thermometer, which we used to fill with mercury. Now we know mercury is a heavy metal that is a very dangerous carcinogen, and so putting it in a glass pipe in a thermometer, for example, which we did when I was a kid, is not very smart. But we would connect this glass-filled tube that had a drop of mercury in it, and we would connect it to a pipe and connect that pipe to the blood pressure cuff around your arm, and then the pressure would force this droplet of mercury up into the pipe, and we would measure how far up this drop of mercury went. In other words, how many millimeters did it ascend when pressurized? And that's where the units of blood pressure comes from. And so when your heart is contracting, your systolic pressure is higher. If you're healthy and young and fit and all the things that I am not, your contraction pressure should be about 120 millimeters of mercury, which is 12 centimeters of mercury, which is about, 4 inches or so, 4 or 5 inches. And then when your heart is relaxing, your diastolic pressure should be about 80. And so that's why we're always talking about blood pressure in terms of one number over another. Because moment to moment, the pressure changes a great deal. You have a high pressure system when the heart is contracting, the ventricle, the left ventricle really, and a low pressure system when the left ventricle is relaxing. So, what happens in this cardiac cycle? The heart muscle is contracting and relaxing. The blood, of course, is collecting in the atria. It's returning to the right atrium from your head and arms and from your legs and torso. It's collecting in the left atrium, coming back from your left lung and from your right lung. So the blood is collecting in your atria, and the AV valves are open, and so the blood flows right down into the ventricles. 70% of the volume flows right down through this hole in the floor, and then the atria have to contract and squirt the last little bit of blood down into the ventricles. Then the ventricles have to contract, and they are what really drive blood circulation, because when the ventricles contract, again, as we've discussed, the right ventricle will drive blood up into the pulmonary trunk on the way to the right and left lungs, and it will only take this path because the AV valve will slam shut. And when the left ventricle contracts, it'll pump blood into your aorta, which goes to every part of your body except your lungs, and it will take this path through the semilunar valve because the AV valve slams shut when the left ventricle is contracting. By the way, these valves slamming shut and the blood sloshing against these now closed valves, those are the sounds you hear in a heartbeat. When you hear thump thump, that are the valves shutting and the blood splashing against those closed valves. That's why you can hear a heartbeat with a stethoscope, or even if you put your ear to someone's chest. Okay, so the ventricles are going to contract to drive your blood circulation, and they're going to contract from the bottom to the top. This is important because if this thing, well, of course, if it contracted this way, if it started here and it started contracting downward, it'd be forcing blood here into this apex, and that wouldn't be very good. So it's just like emptying a tube of toothpaste. You want to squeeze at the bottom, and you want to empty the whole chamber and empty all of this volume up into the aorta. So you want to start the contraction down here and drive the blood upwards in a very coordinated way. Right? We talked last time on Friday about fibrillation. Fibrillation is when all these cells are contracting in a disorganized way and you don't move blood anywhere. You have to stop that with a defibrillator, and under normal circumstances, hopefully all of your life, you will not experience fibrillation, and your heart will always contract in a very coordinated way, and your ventricles will contract from the bottom up, squeezing the blood, pumping the blood upward into the aorta, and pumping the blood upward into this pulmonary trunk. Okay, so that is your cardiac cycle. Here is a pseudo animation of your cardiac cycle. So, where do we start? we start with the atria filling on the right. Blood is returning through the superior vena cava, draining your head and arms. It's returning from your torso and legs through your inferior vena cava, and this atrium is filling, and that blood is flowing really through these open AV valves right into your ventricle. On the left side, it's returning from your lungs. Same thing, flowing through the AV valve into the left ventricle. So that's sort of step one. Then what's going to happen? Then the atria are going to contract. They're going to contract and empty themselves out and force the last little bit of blood through these still open AV valves. Then what's going to happen? The ventricles are going to contract. So now the ventricles contract, and look at the difference. Here's the AV valve open on the right. Here it is slammed shut on the right. Here it is open on the left, and here it is slammed shut on the left. Because now, when the ventricles are contracting, you don't want to send blood backwards into the atria. You want to send blood forwards into the pulmonary trunk on the right side and into the aorta on the left side. So the ventricles contract, that forces the semilunar valves open. The semilunar valve on the left side, the aortic semilunar valve, and the semilunar valve on the right side, the pulmonary semilunar valve. You want the semilunar valves to open with this one-way flow of blood from the ventricles up into these pipes, and you want the AV valves to close. You want them to slam shut so that blood does not go backwards into your atria. Then the next step is now the ventricles are going to relax. They are pretty much empty. They don't empty completely, right? Just like when you squeeze a tube of toothpaste really hard, you don't get every drop of toothpaste out. They don't empty completely, but if you're exercising and your heart is contracting vigorously, you do a pretty good job of emptying the blood out. And now the blood is up in your pulmonary trunk. The blood is up into your aorta, and these chambers, the two ventricles, are relaxing. Again, you don't want this blood to drain downward. You don't want this blood in the aorta to drain downward. And so what does it do? It slams against this one-way valve, which now closes. Here it's open, and here it's closed. And now the blood is prevented from draining backwards and making this pump a relatively inefficient system. Okay, now that we know about the anatomy of a heart and the chambers and pipes and valves associated with the heart, and now that we know all about the cardiac cycle and the sequence of events in terms of when do the atria contract and when do the ventricles contract, now we have to look a bit more closely at the tissue that makes up the heart. This is known as histology. The study of tissues is called histology. There's an entire chapter in your book on histology, and we could have covered it between cells and organ systems, which would make sense in the hierarchy of biology, right? Cells make tissues, and tissues make organs, and organs make organ systems. But in the interest of time, I skipped the histology chapter where we talk about tissues. But I'll talk about tissues in the heart now just a little bit, because we have to figure out not what is going on during this cardiac cycle. We have to ask why it's happening. Why do the atria contract? And then why do the ventricles contract? And why do they contract from the bottom up? Why don't they contract from the top down? Why? I sound like a 2-year-old kid. 2-year-old kids are why machines. All they want to know about is why. And so, why And how your heart beats is all because you have a pacemaker. You may have heard the term pacemaker because we make artificial pacemakers. And in the old days, when I was a kid, you would wear them in your shirt pocket, and then you'd have wires entering your chest, and that was inconvenient. These days, they implant the thing completely into your chest, and there's nothing external, so it makes recreation and showering and swimming much easier to do. But there is an actual cardiac pacemaker. It's known as the SA node, and it's located right about here. It's located in the wall of your right atrium, and it's a bunch of cells, a clump of non-contracting cells that fire, just like neurons fire. They fire spontaneously, all by themselves, over and over again, about 70 times a minute, which of course means that the average heart rate for a healthy human is about 70 or 72 beats a minute. The cardiac cycle lasts about 0.8 seconds. There's 60 seconds in a minute, and so we each have 70 or 72 heartbeats per minute. If you are not fit, your heart might beat 85 or 90 times a minute. If you are very athletic, like the Rucker sisters who are runners, I don't know what their resting heart rates are, but they might be 65 or even 60 or even lower, depending on how fit they are. Anyway, in the normal adult healthy human who's not overly athletic, these cells in your SA node in your right atrium, they spontaneously fire about 70 times a minute. And then they're connected to this conduction system that will conduct this signal from the SA node to the AV node. There's that AV again, which stands for atrioventricular again, and then down junctional fibers in the septum, and the heart will contract in a very coordinated fashion. So that's a lot of terminology. Let's do that again, but let's do it with the benefit of a picture. We're going to have the SA node firing. We're going to have that signal travel to the AV node. We're going to have that signal travel down junctional fibers in the septum, and then you'll see that's going to cause the heart to contract not only in a coordinated fashion, but it's going to cause the ventricles to contract from the bottom up, sending blood up into these pipes. So here is the picture. Here is the SA node in the wall of your right atrium. Here is the AV node in the floor of your right atrium, and it's really embedded in this wall. This wall, you could call this the floor, this partition, you could call this the floor of the atrium, or you could call it the ceiling of the ventricle, right? Depending on your perspective. And so this node is located in this sheet of tissue, this partition of cells that separates the atrium and the ventricle. So that's called the AV node. This thing is what fires first. Again, if it doesn't fire properly, then your physician will implant an artificial pacemaker, which is really just a battery and a wire that will zap this 70 times a minute, making it fire, sending impulses to your AV node, and then down, here's the junctional fibers I mentioned in the septum. What is the septum? The septum is the wall between your ventricles. You might call it an interventricular septum because it's found right between your two ventricles. So the signal goes from the SA node to the AV node to junctional fibers down the septum, and here is the SA node, here's the AV node, here's the junctional fibers in the septum spreading out over the heart muscle. Now you can see lots of things. Now you can see why the atria contract first. They contract first because the SA node fires and sends the signal out over the cells that make up the walls of your atria. And so they contract first and empty out. Now the signal, the SA node has fired, the signal has spread over the walls of the atria, they have contracted, they have emptied, and now the signal is getting to the AV node. Now when the signal gets to the AV node, it's going to be transmitted all the way down to this point of your heart. This is called the apex of your heart. It's going to get transmitted all the way down here to the apex and then spread back upwards. And this is why contraction starts down here. The signal quickly travels all the way here to the apex and then back upwards along the walls and throughout the heart muscle of the ventricle. And so the contraction starts in the bottom and then proceeds upwards, effectively pumping the blood out of these ventricles and into these pipes, the pulmonary trunk, and on the left side into the aorta. So I hope now you understand better why these chambers contract when they do. The SA node starts it all. That signal travels over these atria. They contract first. Then the signal gets to the AV node. That sends a signal right down this septum all the way down to the apex. And that causes the ventricles to contract from the bottom up, pumping blood up into the pulmonary trunk and up into the aorta. And that is what we see in the cardiac cycle. We see the heart at rest. The atria are filling. The blood is draining into the ventricles. Now the atria contract because the SA node has fired and sent impulses throughout the walls of the atria. The blood is pushed through the open AV valves into the ventricles. Now the signal travels down the septum to the apex and causes contraction to start from the bottom. When that contraction starts, the AV valves slam shut and the blood is pumped up into the pulmonary trunk on the right and into the aorta on the left through open semilunar valves. Then the contraction is over, the ventricles start to relax, the semilunar valves close, preventing backflow into the ventricles, and now the atria start filling again, and that blood starts flowing into the ventricles again. And so this is all one great big story. It's not like this slide is separate from this slide. They go hand in hand. And it's not like this slide is separate from this slide. If you don't understand this conduction system, you won't understand this sequence of events. And if you don't understand where the pipes are and where the one-way valves are, you won't understand why blood doesn't flow backwards. So this really is all one great big long story. And so I think that's enough info for one day. I think you need to study this over and over so you can really talk through one heartbeat. Imagine if the next test was just one 40-point essay question. It's not going to be, but it could be, where you tell me this whole story and you tell me about blood arriving from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, and from the lungs. Oh, here we have now, with other things removed by the artist, now you can see the 4 pulmonary veins that are going to flow into this left atrium. And so the atria fill, the blood drains into the ventricles, the SA node fires, that causes the ventricles to contract and really empty out. Then that causes the AV node to fire and send impulses down to the apex. That causes the ventricles to contract from the bottom up. That causes these AV valves to slam shut. That causes the semilunar valves to open, and the blood in the ventricles gets sent upward into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Anyway, it's all one great, big, beautiful story, and I expect you to know all these details. And so, get to work, start studying, We are essentially done with the heart and we're done with the blood. And that means on Wednesday, we have only one more job, and that is we have to understand your blood vessels. We have to talk about the difference between arteries and veins. We have to talk about more about blood pressure and why you get high blood pressure and why if you have high blood pressure, your physician tells you to eat less salt, etc., etc. We have to talk about flow through the pipes. We know about blood, we know about the pump, and now we got to talk about the pipes. That's what we're doing on Wednesday, and then on Friday, we'll start a new chapter. So, have a lovely day. I will talk to you soon.